Hey everyone, it's Nelson DeWitt, and I'm here today with my mother, and
Hi.
and we're going to be talking about the book that she's working on. And I thought it would be neat to kind of go into some of the details behind the book and what went into putting this whole thing together. So, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I've been following Nelson's blog for quite some time, but this is my first opportunity to sort of appear on it. My husband Tom and I had the idea that this story was so interesting we really should write a book. And I don't really remember when we first thought about that, but we always kind of said, well, when we're no longer so professionally active and we have more time, we'll write a book together. And in the early 2000s, probably around 2002, it became sort of obvious to me that this was never going to happen if one of us didn't sort of take the responsibility. And I was winding up a book I was writing. I've been in German literature for many years and teaching German, and that book project was coming to an end. And I thought, okay, this is the time. I knew that my retirement wasn't too far off, but I thought I could already begin in a really earnest way doing the kind of research I thought might really be necessary to put Nelson's story and our story in a larger historical context that would be of interest to a general public.
And so one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that you actually put a lot of time researching what went on in the country, and also you went down to Central America and spent some time with my family, interviewing them and asking them questions about everything that happened within my birth family, and trying to just uncover bits and pieces of the story. So I'd love to hear some of that experience.
Okay. Back in 2004, I really got serious about starting, and I knew that I needed to learn more Spanish and that I needed to ask more questions. I mean, by this time, we knew Nelson's birth family since 1997. There had been a lot of back and forth. We had visited, they had visited us. We were in touch with each other on a regular basis, but it took a little time to be ready to do to ask some more difficult questions about the past. And I thought I needed to at least try to do interviews with them in Spanish, which was going to be a really hard thing for me to learn. So I started taking Spanish at Wellesley College, where I teach German, and I felt by 2004 that I was a little bit better prepared, and that year at Christmas, the whole family went down to Central America and spent some time with members of his family in Costa Rica and then in Panama. And then Derek and I stayed on. Nelson had to come back because he was in college then, right?
Yeah, that was my finishing my
right,
senior year.
Yeah, and Derek had a little bit more time before he needed to come back home, and he and I took some intensive Spanish lessons at an institute in San Jose, Costa Rica. And that really helped me get to maybe a sort of advanced intermediate level, so I felt, that I could handle interview situations with the family. Well, they knew me, so they were going to be friendly interviewees. But, I felt I really needed to make the attempt to be able to talk with them in Spanish. So in 2005, in the early year, then Derek came home, and I was the only one in the family left, and I traveled around and I did do some interviews both with his sister and his grandma and Mama Chila in Costa Rica, and then I went to El Salvador for a while and stayed with his Aunt Dalila.
And you were there for
a couple weeks.
A couple weeks,
and I also I stayed part of the time with members of the maternal side of Nelson's family and part of the time with members from the paternal side of his family, with his uncle and an aunt. And that was a really interesting time for me because I lived in their homes, and so we had a lot of chance for conversation. I got a little more confident about my Spanish, and things came up. I mean, they really were willing to be sort of interviewed where I had questions about things in the story. And even though we thought we understood various things about the story, new information came out in those conversations that were really important to putting it all together. In addition, with the help of these relatives, I was able to go and use some newspaper archives, particularly in El Salvador, that was really useful in the more historical chapter. I should also add that Nelson's father down in Panama did an interview with me and the three siblings, Toto and Eva and Nelson, Roberto and myself, which was very important, I think, too.
Yeah, and I've found that during this whole process that the developments kind of come in spurts. That you know, initially we didn't know a whole lot, and then as we started to ask more questions, someone would remember something, and it would spark, you know, and then it was sort of another missing piece to the puzzle, and so it kind of, you know, it came and went in spurts while we're trying to put this all together.
I mean, it has probably something to do with the nature of memory, and with painful memories there can be, you know, sort of a kind of repression of memory, and sometimes also it just probably never occurred to the person that that was an important piece. You know? I think what we also discovered, or what I certainly discovered as I was then writing parts of the book, was that going back to my own archives, I had kept journals when we were experiencing some of the important parts of this, including the adoption.
Yep.
And I had saved papers of our whole adoption process. But this was like 20 years later, and you're going back and you're rereading this, and you discover things that you'd forgotten.
Yeah.
Or that you'd remember differently when you would tell the story. So one of the things that I thought that for me is important in the book was try to recover as much as I could of the truth of the matter, but also show that process. So in the book, I think the readers will kind of go through with not knowing and then discovering. I try to make that process sort of a part of telling the story.
And to me, the book is very much sort of the way that we experienced it as a family, starting with starting with this very interesting adoption, and then not really knowing any information, and then having these things sort of build over time.
Yeah, I really decided in writing about it, because I thought about it a long time, you know, how am I going to put all this, because it's confusing, and there are lots of different strands, and different countries, and different political groups, and I thought, how am I going to put this all together? And somehow the sort of strict chronological telling, that didn't seem to me to be the way to do it. I wanted people to experience it kind of the way we did, how we kind of put it together, and also then leave them with the holes that are still there, the things that we don't know and we'll probably never know, the things about your mother that we'll never know what exactly happened to her, and to try to face that. So for me, I think this whole process, and I should say that being an academic, in addition to the family interviews, one of the things that was really important for me was to do the kind of research you do as an academic, to read the literature about the Salvadorian Civil War, you know, what's out there in the academic literature, so that I could better understand the background and why his parents did what they did, and to try to explore that by knowing more about it. And that was a really interesting process for me and I've tried to sort of pass that knowledge on to my readers.
Well, we are all very excited for the book. I know a lot of you out there have been saying that you can't wait to see this. And we actually had a discussion earlier about you know, the power of sort of social media and all the social networks. So if you could do me a favor and come back to the Facebook group and leave a comment about this video, and just to kind of show what it's like out there. Anyway, we're very excited about the book. As I said before, we're still talking to publishers and seeing if anyone's willing to put this thing out. And when we can talk and tell you more about what's going to happen, we will. And thank you again so much for joining the group, for being a part of this, and we'll talk to you later. Take care.
Bye-bye.